I was in my teens in the 1950s, and I was in the Scouts. And that's where I started to get involved in actually actively taking part in music. We had music lessons at school, but they were a small part of the timetable. But like all teenagers, we listened to the current music, and in the middle 1950s, the popular music, or part of it, was skiffle. And skiffle was a term that was used in the 50s to describe ad hoc groups that got together to make do-it-yourself music using all sorts of instruments. Obviously some real instruments like guitars and banjos, double basses, but also improvised ones like tea-chest basses and washboards. And I started on the washboards in a skiffle group in the Scouts. The British skiffle groups were mostly, at that time, splinter groups within traditional jazz bands. So they would do a middle spot in their programme where maybe 4 from the 7-piece band would form the skiffle group and play. And I suppose it was a natural progression for us that we got interested in the music of the jazz band as well. And gradually, almost all of us moved on to jazz from skiffle. But it was an interesting time.
So how did you move then from skiffle to jazz? What was the journey?
It was just hearing the parent bands. Some of the recordings we were listening to were a couple of skiffle tracks on a jazz LP. And obviously you would listen to the other tracks as well, and most of us were attracted by the music. For me, what attracted me to both skiffle and jazz was a rhythm. It was the beat, the swing, as they call it in jazz, that attracted me in the first place. And buying records and getting interested in what the bands were doing, you started to have thoughts about, I wonder if I could have a shot at this. But I started off on washboard, tried guitar, didn't make anything of it. But once we all got into jazz, we didn't have a bass player. So the bass chose me rather than me choosing the bass, and my parents bought me one. And that was me started.
And do you remember where you, because I think it's always fascinating, the stories around getting your first instrument. Where did you go?
It was bought from a music shop in the centre of Edinburgh. And as it turned out, the fellow in the shop who sold me the bass was himself a bass player. His name was Jerry Rossi, a good player. And he was playing with one of the leading Dixieland bands in town at that time. So he very kindly helped me a bit. I never had any lessons, no formal lessons whatsoever. And that was commonly the case, certainly for my generation, I think the preceding one. We're nearly all self-taught, with a little bit of help, but in my case, no formal music lessons apart from the small amount that happened at school.
And did you form a band with friends, or how did you get into the actual performing?
The first band we formed was a schoolboy band. People of my age group, late teens, just starting, just learning their instruments. And I think that was the case with most of the local musicians. And we got together to practice. And then the course of events from there on, I think, in my case, was typical of most of us. The local bands played in pubs, mostly, and we go along to hear them, and we made ourselves known, and that occasionally we'd be invited to sit in, which means going up and playing a couple of numbers with the band. And this all helped to establish you as an active player. And gradually that would develop into being asked to occasionally deputise, or depping as we call it, for someone in one of the established bands. And you got better as you went along. A few dropped out, they found the interest just waning. A lot of us stuck it. And that happened with me. It was a schoolboy band, which was called the Mound City Jazz Band. And then I moved up to play with a band led by a clarinet player called Jack St. Clair. And then briefly a band called the New Savoy Jazz Band. And then I joined the Old Bailey Band, Old Bailey's Jazz Advocates, which was a well-known and successful local band. And I've remained associated with them for many years. By 1957-58, by 59, 60, I'd got a bass and was beginning to play with the schoolboy band. And then into the early 60s, about the time I was leaving school, I was starting to play with some of the better known bands in town. But we were all amateur, or at best semi-professional, as we called it, which meant we got paid for some of the work we did, but not all of it. Most of the jazz was in pubs, although there was a very odd time for jazz generally in this country in the late 50s and just into the 60s, which became known as the trad boom. And it was a strange business because suddenly there was jazz was popular with the public. It's seldom been that, with the exception maybe of the swing era in the 1930s when it was at the top of the tree. But apart from that, jazz was seldom in a position where it was selling enough records to appear in the hit parade, for example. But in the late 50s, that started to happen. And suddenly, jazz was on the media, television programs, radio programs, and that produced locally some people who set up clubs. So these clubs were operating as well as the pubs, and some of them operated in the pubs. So that was largely where we did our playing, in addition to what were called private gigs, which meant it was a booking to play at a function. It could be a dance or a wedding or whatever. So it was quite varied, but mostly in the pubs.
And what was the audience like in those days?
Well, jazz up to that point had probably been a minority interest, and there were serious jazz followers that went way back even before the World War II. There was a coterie of people interested in jazz. But this odd time at the end of the 50s and into the 60s, there was a young group as well who were buying records, and people like Ackerbilk and Kenny Ball and Chris Barber's bands were actually featuring in the hit parade. But locally, these two groups were reflected in the people we attracted. There were serious jazz people who'd always been interested in music. And then there was lots of younger people, many of them students, who were attracted because of its current popularity in the way that youngsters usually follow a trend. So it was a mixed group.
And was that your life? Could you make your income from jazz?
No. It never even a faint possibility for me. I was nothing like good enough. And anyway, I saw it as a hobby music. So I was only going to play locally, occasional trips away. But no, I went another way. Became a student and studied and had a professional career. But jazz remained in my life as a major hobby and a major interest, mostly playing and listening too, of course.
And who were your influencers, do you think?
Who was I listening to?
Who influenced you?
Influenced me? Well, you couldn't but be aware of the British traditional bands that were very popular at that time. And I was fortunate in contacts at school introduced me to American jazz. I got some recordings of good American traditional jazz bands. These records were readily available, although none of us had much money. But we managed to buy the records and listen to the source of the music, because it was an American music. And I was very much influenced by bands like Kid Ory's band, the white Chicagoan musicians who were grouped around the guitarist Eddie Condon. And then from there, my interest developed over the years, and I started listening to the big bands as well, particularly the Duke Ellington band. And then later I became keen on the swing bands led by people like Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, and so on. It's probably true to say I was more interested in the smaller groups rather than the 12, 14-piece orchestras, or even bigger. And mostly I listened to what the Americans would call Dixieland, although in this country there was a bit of a split in interest, even within the traditional jazz world. Traditional jazz had an extraordinary recovery in the 1940s when there was a worldwide re-interest in earlier forms of jazz. And it became known as the revival. And initially, the revival was really an interest in what I would call classic jazz, the music of people like Louis Armstrong, King Oliver, Jelly Roll Morton. But later, slightly later, there was a different form of traditional jazz that was very, very popular. And that was going back to jazz roots, mostly in New Orleans, predating the 1920s. And there were still some people, jazz musicians in New Orleans and elsewhere, who were still playing that same music. They became known, the followers of that particular strand became known as purists, because they had a liking for jazz which they perceived as being less commercial, truer to its roots. And that music came along as well. So there was a definite split between the two camps. And the 1940s generation in Edinburgh produced some high-class musicians. Al Fairweather, Sandy Brown, Alex Welsh, Archie Semple, Dave Keir, Stan Gregg, and others. And most of them, all of the ones I mentioned really, were playing in the classic jazz tradition of Armstrong and others. And because they were so good, many of them headed south to London, where there was far more work, and if you wanted to play professionally, London was a good base. It's where the agents were based and so on. So it was probably true that by the time I came into local jazz in the very late 50s, the purist side of the revival was stronger, simply because we'd lost an awful lot of top-class musicians from that earlier group that played classic jazz.
And how was it different sounding in Edinburgh, or did it simply mimic what you were hearing on records, or was it interpreted in your practice?
It would be true to say that initially everyone was imitating what they heard on record, but there were some gifted musicians locally, and they soon put their stamp on the music. Particularly somebody like Sandy Brown, Archie Semple, who became very much their own men, playing jazz their way. And you can hear it in the recorded music. You can look into the record and hear how initial influences remained but became less prominent in the players' approach to jazz, and they became much more individualized.
And what about your own playing?
On playing. I tried to teach myself. I couldn't play piano, but I knew enough about piano keyboard to start understanding chord structure. And listening to the records of jazz, it was quite difficult sometimes hearing the bass. It's not the most prominent instrument, especially on the relatively primitive hi-fi equipment we had in those days, but I tried to listen and so on. But just as important as that for me was going out and listening to established local bands and listening to what the bass players were doing, and occasionally speaking to them and getting tips and so on. So, like most of my generation who played that music at that time, I was self-taught by imitating both records, recorded music, and the local players.
And when you began to get gigs, how did that work in Edinburgh?
Well, the bands were either totally amateur or semi-pro, and they would play in pubs. Often they would have what was called a residency, where they played in that pub on the same night every week. And in addition to that, they'd get some private bookings for all sorts of different things, celebrations and what have you. But I started by having gone to the pubs to hear established local bands and being asked to sit in, and then eventually being asked to fill in for someone who was temporarily not there. And then eventually I was offered a place in a band that was quite established. And the thing with the bands in those days was to find residencies, at least one in a week if you could do it. And that provided your main outlet for your music. It's where you got most practice too, in the sense of actually playing together. And there was no money in the pubs. We didn't really play because we were being paid very much money, because we weren't. Some of the pubs I can remember had to operate as clubs, jazz clubs, because there was great resistance to jazz in pubs from the police and from the local authorities. I've never been quite sure why, but I suspect it was because of either a post-war attitude of needing to control everything in daily life, or an association with illicit drinking and drugs. Now, there was drinking went on, but there was very little drug taking that I was ever aware of in the early days when I was playing. But the police didn't like these clubs. And there was a famous club that was founded by Sandy Brown in Edinburgh. It was called the Stud Club. And it was short for the Student Club. And it was set up initially in a pub, the Crown Bar in Lothian Street, now long gone. But the club survived, but it had to keep moving its premises. And everywhere it went, the police would make a visit and close them down. And even when they were established as jazz clubs, the police would come to make sure that it was being run as a club with proper membership, registration, membership cards, and so on. The money that they took at the door was tiny. People were paying something like sixpence in old money to get in. And then the money was split up between the band at the end of the night. So the money was totally insignificant. Jim Petrie, the Edinburgh trumpet player who's still playing now, I depped with his band somewhere around 1960 in the Crown Bar, and at the end of the night I was given 4 shillings and sixpence. And Jim said to me, hey, don't spend it all on the one bus. So there wasn't much money in it.
And did you supplement by touring or recording, or was that not part of the scene?
In the early days, these were vague aspirations for all the local bands, although a few of them started to make a few recordings, but not on a commercial basis. The Old Bailey Band, which I joined in 1964, had made a single with one of the local recording companies in Edinburgh, but it was only sold by the band around the places they were playing. So, and although there was a few gigs when we would travel to the borders or up into Fife, something like that, there was no prospect of tours abroad or anything like that in those days.
So there wasn't really an economy in the way that you think about being a musician nowadays.
It
didn't have an economy around it whereby you could plot out.
No. When I came into the music, it was an amateur music. There were some top-class players. I mentioned some of them earlier, but there was others who came along in the 50s, like Ken Ramage, trombone player, Jack Duff, a very good reeds player, Alex Shaw, top-class piano player, Ronnie Ray, a very fine bass player. These guys came along, and they were good enough to have serious thoughts about a professional career. But it nearly always took them away from Edinburgh, either permanently or for tours before coming back to their base. But for the rest of us, this was an amateur music. It was a hobby music for us, which didn't mean that we weren't serious about it. Many of us were very interested in jazz indeed, quite committed to the music. But apart from these top-class players, the rest of us were content to have our day jobs and play jazz as a hobby.
And what were the audiences like? I mean, if they had to be members and things, presumably that meant that it was always the same people coming.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Wherever you played, particularly in the pubs, you recognised the people every week, came in regularly to support the band and listen to the music they liked. At that time, there were the older, serious jazz people who'd followed the music for a long time, but there was a big influx of younger people, partly attracted by this trad boom thing and the successful bands, but a lot of students who were getting interested in jazz for its own sake, not because it was part of the pop music of the day. But later, as they went through the 60s, the 70s, and into the 80s, there were some pubs that became very established as jazz centres, and they would attract a decent-sized crowd. And it was interesting that people would come along every week, and they looked to get the same seats every week. They were quite put out if someone had taken their regular seat. But it was a very comfortable thing because these people were there because they supported the band that was playing and they liked the music.
And I'm hoping that we can't hear whatever talking there is next door. In terms of present day, I mean, are you still performing, and if so, how have things changed?
I'm still playing now. It sheds a light on what's happened in local jazz. That back in the very early 60s, I was quite often the youngest person in the band. And the band I've been playing in regularly over the last number of years, I'm still the youngest person in the band, and I'm 76 now. So it shows how it's really the same group of musicians with very few young people coming in over the years that have moved on through the decades. And it's the same with the crowd. People you remember coming to listen to the music back in the 70s, 80s, some of them are still turning up now.
And why is that, do you think?
A generational thing, I should think. The music that we got interested in originally had been a form of popular music pre-war, 20s music, 30s music, and then the 40s with the revival. But the interest in that music inevitably would wane as time went past. You lost the novelty of a newish music. Even swing, which was the big band music of the late 30s and into the middle 40s, was immensely popular in the States and over here, but it faded too. And I think that's what happens to music. And of course, there were huge changes in the music itself. The biggest change was the advent of more modern forms, new modern thinking about jazz that came along in the 40s, became known as modern jazz. And it really was revolutionary. It changed the music completely, particularly brought in a different attitude to rhythm, different attitude to harmony, and it sounded very different. Looking at it then, a lot of people were very alarmed by it because it was so different. Looking back now, you can see its relationship to the mainstream of jazz. It's still the same music with the same principles driving it along, and with improvisation as an important part of it, and still with the accent on a swinging rhythm.
And finally, what, if I had to ask you to cast your mind back over the decades, what would be your favourite or clearest memory still?
Favourite memories? There's two answers to that, I think. The first one is I was fortunate enough to play in some very good local bands, bands which stayed together long enough to really become an integrated band. Jazz does depend on rapport between the musicians playing together, and that was tremendously satisfying when that happened. But the other answer to the question is the chance to play with some big names in jazz. It started for me in the 70s when the band I was playing in was lucky enough to play with touring American musicians who came over as a solo and were featured with local bands. And I played with Bud Freeman and Wild Bill Davison in concerts. But of course, with the advent of the Edinburgh Jazz Festival, which started in 1979, there was huge opportunity for many of us to hear these great names that were coming over, but for some of us also the chance to play with them. And looking back, that was immensely satisfying. It's quite frightening at the time, but very, very satisfying. And it's quite hard to look back and believe that in one or two jazz festivals, I played sessions where the solo guest was an American called Benny Waters. And Benny Waters' career had really marched along with that of jazz itself. And he'd played in the early 30s and the late 20s, early 30s with King Oliver's band and recorded them with them. And to think that I had the chance to play with someone like that was really quite extraordinary.